morning, Hannah. Thank you for joining me. I'm Victoria. For those watching the video that don't know me, I'm a senior associate in the employment team here at Clarion, and I'm joined by Hannah Jepson, who is business psychologist and director at Engaging for Success, which is an organisation committed to social change and really hot on equality, diversity and inclusion, which is what we're going to be chatting about this morning. Just as a reminder of how this video fits into what we're doing at Clarion, we have a programme of webinars and seminars aimed at rising stars in HR, but it's also handy for anyone who is new to people management or looking to get a good refresher on basic concepts. And we run an annual programme each year, and this is a complementary video to fit in with that. Hannah, I'll hand over to you in a moment, but I thought it might be useful to kick off with just touching on the concepts of equality, diversity and inclusion, because I think I know what they are, but I think there's subtle differences between each, so I'm hoping to learn something too, and I thought it might be useful to run through. So over to you, if that's okay.
Absolutely, and yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Let me just share my slide with you, because I just thought it'd be helpful for me to put a few slides next to what I'm saying, so that you don't have to, those watching, you don't have to kind of scribble away. You've got some notes here. So yeah, obviously Victoria talked a little bit about me and what we do at Engaging for Success. And as I say, our core business over the last few years has been supporting organisations to develop their equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. And that starts with thinking about what these terms actually mean. So I think that if you kind of break it down, and I've added a couple more in here, actually equality is something that really organisations should be doing now as, as standard practice. It's more about adherence and compliance. It sits behind the kind of legislation around the Equality Act, which is obviously the most recent piece of kind of big legislation around equality, diversity and inclusion. But that's something that really should be happening as a kind of standard practice. It's not something that, is really seen anymore as particularly progressive. Moving forward, just to take the concepts you spoke about, Victoria, diversity is sort of the one that's intensified over the last 20 years in organisations. And that's more about placing value on difference and understanding that, organisations that have placed that value on difference in terms of both their staff and their stakeholders are the organisations that really can thrive. Inclusion takes it kind of one step further, and inclusion is actually about that individual's experience. So it's all very well and good saying we've got a diverse and representative staff body, but actually if those individuals within the organisation don't feel included, then there's still more work to do. So inclusion is kind of considered that kind of last part of the puzzle, really, to unlocking that power of diversity. Can people feel confident to be themselves and work in a way that feels authentic to them? I just added a couple more in here that lots of organisations are now talking about more frequently, which is firstly is equity. So lots of people dropping that term equality and focusing on equity, which of course still says people should have access to the same opportunity. But equity tells you then that, yes, that's the case, but actually we need to understand that people came from different start points in life, and we need to understand the root causes of that disparity before we can helpfully do something for those groups. And then belonging takes it one step further than that, which is actually, do you feel included in that organisation? But also, do you feel like you belong? Do you really feel, if asked, that you belong to that organisation in terms of the culture that's there? So, but that's a kind of brief touch on some of those terminologies and how they've evolved.
That's really useful, thank you. And what I picked up on in that is that actually maybe the law actually still has some way to go. There are certain characteristics protected by law, such as gender, race, sexuality, plus a few others. But actually the movement that is really important is a bit deeper than that. It sounds like it's more society. So your background, your class, your experience in life, which I find really interesting. And the law isn't quite there yet. So maybe there's still some way to go. maybe raising awareness is the first part. So hopefully I will learn something today as we go through as well. And Hannah, why do you think a lot of this is coming to the forefront now more so than ever before?
Yeah, really, really good point. I think that, certainly in the last 18 months or so, of course, we've seen the global landscape change in terms of what's happened in the world, and people kind of understanding or seeing that organizations don't exist as a bubble from the rest of society and what's going on. And I think if you look at the last kind of 5 to 10 years, the world, broadly has become, more divisive. And I think that, organizations can see that they have a part to play in kind of fostering that cohesion. So I think that it's coming to the fore much more because that kind of interface between society and business is closing. And I think people can see that as well. And also I think that people just, there's much more research emerging about why this is important. And I think that when we talk about this, of course, there are kind of three cases that I would put to organizations to kind of encourage them to do this work. Of course, there's the legal case, which we know about, and we don't need to go into in detail today. Then there's the kind of strategic case, which I said at the start, organizations that do this work thrive. So lots of the research says, and there's a couple here, bits of research from Deloitte, from CIPD, from McKinsey, that say that actually having visible role models, it is going to foster that social cohesion. Research shows that those diverse teams are more creative, they're more adaptive, and also those staff are more likely to stay and be happy in those organizations. So lots of reasons why, and also, lots of research that says, actually this does impact on bottom line. Yeah. So there is a strategic kind of case for this, but also there's a moral case. So I think that's the other case. That's a kind of, if you take it as the legal, the strategic and the moral case, organizations should reflect the clients and communities they serve. And that's just about having a broader and deeper understanding of those clients and communities. And also, one of the things is around that moral case is it is just the right thing to do. There's a model, if it piques anyone's interest today, there's a model called Myers Minority Stress Model. And essentially that's telling you that those people who belong to minoritized or marginalized groups do experience stress more acutely than those who don't belong to those groups, because there's that kind of added layer of marginalization. So in terms of linking this also to employee well-being and those sorts of things, we know that it's kind of, the research tells us that it is just also the right thing to do. And of course, I said, there's the law. And then again, I just wanted to point people to a book called Rebel Ideas, which really captures the essence of what I just said, which is just that organizations with a breadth of perspective are better at solving problems. How can you possibly expect to solve a very complex problem if everybody's from the same background and everyone shares the same perspective? So Rebel Ideas kind of captures that really beautifully. And I'll pause there, but that's why I think diversity and inclusion is really kind of ramping up within organizations at the moment.
I agree. Some of that resonates with things that people I talk to through my work say to me. And what strikes me is that actually comfortable, happy people actually perform better, and that means better for business as well. And I think people are cottoning onto that, which is great. I guess one of the things that we thought about when planning this session was that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. If your background and your thinking is only cultured to be a certain way, it can be difficult you want to do the right thing, but maybe you don't know where to begin. And we talked about the concept of bias. So I wondered if you can maybe just outline what that is, please.
Yeah, of course. So lots of you listening, watching this will have heard organizations talk about unconscious bias and what that is. And so I'll try and capture it very briefly, but essentially, if we start with the concept of a heuristic is a kind of mental shortcut or a rule of thumb that allows you to solve problems really quickly. So something that you don't think about, but if you think about from the minute you got up this morning to the minute you go to bed later this evening, there's lots of things that you'll do without consciously kind of effortfully thinking about them. And that's a heuristic, because the human brain processes an extraordinarily large amount of information every single second. If we were to consciously think about those things, we just wouldn't have functioned, we wouldn't survive, and we wouldn't have evolved. So heuristics are a really good thing. However, cognitive biases or unconscious implicit biases, they're a sort of, I would say, a flawed heuristic, because where a heuristic helps us think about, to kind of navigate processes and think about objects. So for example, you don't touch the kettle because you know it's boiling, but you don't consciously think about that. So where heuristics might apply to processes, objects, and things, this kind of bias has evolved to apply to people, or categorizing safely for us groups of people. So that's where I would call it, a sort of flawed heuristic. It is a mental shortcut. It is a rule of thumb, but actually what it is often is a generalization about people based on their identity to another group. So they happen out of our control, as I say, they're implicit. They're held by us all. So that's a really important thing to say when you talk about bias, is there's no hierarchy in this. Because I'm a business psychologist with expertise in this, I'm not immune to this. I still have biases. They're learned stereotypes, deeply ingrained, born out of our experiences. And ultimately, the kind of basis for bias is that they are a protective mechanism. So what I mean by that is that in-group, out-group bias, i.e. being wary of difference, seeing other as a threat, is the thing that's kept us alive. The issue is that prejudice is now hardwired into our human cognition, and we still perceive that difference or other as a threat. And we make those categorizations in that way, which of course doesn't serve us well kind of in the modern world. So that's a really, really kind of whistle-stop tour of what bias is. And I thought that this was a good quote from Cornish in 2018, who talks about how it kind of can manifest in a kind of deep, but sometimes worrying way. So whenever two events occur together, neurons are connected in the brain. You might read about a Muslim terrorist, and the next time you hear the word Muslim, the word terrorist comes into your mind, especially if that reporting is negative and disproportionate, which of course we know that it is incredibly disproportionate. Take lots of other different groups. This reporting is negative and disproportionate. But Cornish says, we've got to be the ones there that are vigilant and, constantly challenge the biases that are being laid down in our heads. So you might not have chosen those biases, and largely you won't have, but it doesn't mean that it's not our responsibility to do something about that. So if you think about, as I say, the last kind of 15 years and the way that the mainstream media have disproportionately and negatively reported on, let's say, the Muslim community or the gay community, we are exposed to those damaging stereotypes day in, day out. So it's up to us then to try and unearth what our biases are and do something about it, so that we're not making those negative and disproportionate kind of generalizations.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, I've got a 2-year-old, and I'm really alive to this, because I've noticed that all little boy clothes and little boy toys, there's tools, tractors, everything's blue, and then for little girls it's all pink, and kitchens and baby dolls. And you think that is so deeply ingrained from such a young age, and I find it quite interesting, really, and try and move away from that. So it's from a very young age, isn't it? But I think you're right, it's awareness and making it more of a conscious thing than unconscious.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So how do we think it all fits into the EDI stuff that might help us in the business world? How does this all feed in?
Yeah, okay. So just to kind of wrap things up around bias, as you just said, Victoria, kind of those, we can't really get away from those life inputs. So as you say, it's your experiences, what you read, the people you spend your time with, the clothes that you have access to buy, all those sorts of things, they kind of go into our brains throughout our lives. It doesn't just happen at childhood, and they become deeply ingrained and embedded. And then we have this kind of distorted view of the world. So my view of the world is going to be very different to your view of the world, because we've had different lives and different upbringings. But we have to be really cognizant of that so that we can kind of challenge it. The other thing to say is that, bias is more likely to happen, to kind of trip us up, when we are tired or busy, when we're stressed, when we've got to act fast or make a quick decision, And also, to the point I made before, when we're all the same, because there's no one to challenge that kind of group think, if you like. So I think that that's how, that's some of the ways where it does tie into the kind of diversity and inclusion agenda and the work within the business world. Because actually, if you have a business where people are incredibly tired and stressed, and people are having to make quick decisions, and you have a group of people, you know, who are all the same, then that bias is going to kick in, and it's going to kind of perpetuate, and you know, then you get a situation where you are kind of you know, making decisions that aren't necessarily objective or impartial. And I think that when you think about businesses and how they operate, of course, then you know that bias can then permeate, you know, all of the decision making across that business, big or small. So it can affect you know, talent programs, who has access to those talent programs, appraisal, performance review outcome. You know, there's lots of research that tells us that, you know, underrepresented groups do less well on appraisal ratings and performance review outcomes. Mm-hmm. It can affect internal hiring. And critically, one of the places where bias is really, really, really rife is recruitment. So I think that's one of the ways where we need to kind of really be careful, because ultimately what that can lead to is this kind of, and let me make sure that I can say this properly because it's still quite early in the morning for me, homogeneities prevail. So, you know, i.e. we're recruiting people in our image, or we're recruiting people who fit the business. And actually, that's where you have to challenge that culture fit and flip that mindset to culture add. What's the culture add here rather than the culture fit, so that we're not just recruiting people who are all the same as us.
And therefore who would respond in the same way when under pressure and all the things we just talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So I think recruitment, if we were to think about the employee life cycle and start there, what sort of things do you think people could think about? Do you have any top tips that maybe you could offer for those watching today, just to challenge thought processes around that stage of the life cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, one of the things to think about is, you know, as I talk through these very briefly, has this kind of played out for you in your recruitment process, either recruitment processes that you've been involved in or that you've kind of seen or witnessed, you know? So I think bias can play out in that real decision making kind of at the very start. So confirmation bias, so that's the kind of making snap judgments based on our kind of perceived truth and subsequently looking for the evidence that kind of backs that up. So, you know, that can translate into an interviewer asking leading questions so that they get the answer that they want. Effect heuristics are all about that mental shortcut, and that's when a panel will jump to a conclusion about a candidate's ability, and that might be based on, they might have come from the same university as them, so they might think, well, they're going to be good because they've had the same experience as me. And we're all very you know, we're all prone to these biases. Halo and horns kind of are the way that our first impressions bleed into everything else. So if it's a negative horns effect, we might subsequently struggle to see that candidate in a positive light, and the kind of other way around. So, you know, there's lots of ways. Similarity bias, so we're attraction bias, we're more inclined to hire candidates who are like us. Contrast effect, this is kind of, we've got a tendency to compare the last person we've seen to the next person, rather than taking them, you know, at that baseline and just judging them by the criteria. And then intuition is another one that I see lots and lots in recruitment. You know, people talk about their gut feeling, and actually that's where it's really important that you have a process that is objective, that is standardized, that can't be kind of skewed by people's opinions, because actually this is about facts. And when you start relying on your gut, that's when the bias is going to kick in. So there's lots and lots of things that you can kind of just familiarize yourselves with about how bias might play out in recruitment. And, you know, maybe when you've listened to this session, it might be worth thinking about some of the biases that I've shared with you today, and thinking about, where have you seen these crop up in recruitment processes that you've been involved in, and what can you do about that? Ultimately, I think the top tip is designing more inclusive processes. So, you know, how do you do that? Widening your kind of talent pool is really important. So thinking about, is your incoming talent pool all the same? Is your search very narrow? Are you getting what you need? You know, can you actually, you know, can you truly hand on heart say that you've looked, you know, in terms of diversity, that you really are looking far and wide for new talent? Or are you going to the same places over and over again, and therefore getting the same thing that you've always got? So, asking yourself those critical questions. What are you doing currently to increase those applications from diverse backgrounds? Of course, making sure that, this is all around positive action, not positive discrimination, but, really, really important that you think about these things and ask yourself those questions. Educate yourself. If you don't know much about bias, maybe this is the start point for you, but use this as a start point to kind of do a bit more research about bias and how it might impact on you and your teams. The other thing is, creating a really safe space to discuss your biases, unearthing them and saying, actually, I think that I have some biases here, can take the kind of power out of it, particularly if you're thinking about an interview process. So thinking about, once you finish that interview, naming your biases before you get into scoring, and rating that candidate can be really powerful to reduce the bias. Making sure your panel's diverse, that's really important. Again, making sure you've got that breadth of perspective, and also from a candidate experience, it's good to see yourself represented. That's going to be a really positive experience for a candidate. And the other thing, which I know might sound very, very simple, but it's about taking kind of verbatim notes. And I think we don't write much anymore, really, do we? And I think people potentially find it hard, but where you can, taking those verbatim notes is going to be really important to reduce that bias. That's honestly one of the most powerful things you can do, because then you are relying on your actual notes rather than trying to recall what happened. Because if you recall what happened, our bias will fill in the gaps. And when our bias fills in the gaps, we're going to make it based on our own experiences or what we believe to be important. Really, really important. Get feedback from unsuccessful candidates, especially if they're from an underrepresented group. How did they experience the process? Thinking about recruitment data, what does it tell you? Who dropped out when? And why was that the case? Who isn't applying? And why is that the case? Trying to really make that data work for you. And also, don't want to kind of worry anyone, but the other thing is, don't be afraid to kind of start again. If the process actually isn't working and you are getting the same people over and over again, try something different, think about how you can change that recruitment process. So I know that's lots and lots of information, maybe more than top 3 tips, but just things throughout that kind of recruitment process that you might want to think about to kind of de-bias or mitigate as much as you can for some of those biases that might crop up.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. I think recruitment phase is super important because it sets the tone for the rest of the life cycle, doesn't it? And just with my legal hat on, what people often don't realise is that there is a legal duty to candidates. You can, if you discriminate, which is a step further than being biased in most instances, but if you discriminate, you can have liability to somebody that you haven't even employed and has never done a day's work for you. So it's important to get it right from the outset. And I have, during the 11 years that I've been with Clarion, seen cases where we've had a candidate deliberately, to be fair, submit CVs with different names on, and seen a different outcome on each, and then pursued a claim off the back of it. So it does happen, and it's useful to have that awareness and help call it out, to do the right thing like you were talking about, but also to avoid legal risk, and then hopefully improve the rest of the employee journey. So yeah, that was super useful. Thank you, Hannah, for joining me this morning and running through those concepts. If anyone would like to know any more detail about these issues, then please get in touch. Please get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to support. And then the next Rising Stars session, for anyone who would like to join us, is on the 3rd of February, and we'll be looking at whistleblowing as a topic in that session, and looking at a case study on how to spot what a whistleblower is and how to deal with it when you get one. And it might be that actually an allegation of discrimination would fit into that, so it would flow on nicely. So please do join us. Any queries, send them over, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.